Hello, everybody. You've made it to the final lecture on substance abuse. We're going to go right through this as quickly as we can today. One of the things that I want to point out and start with for this lecture is just starting with the chapter title here of substance abuse. So this is a perfectly appropriate phrase. Some of you, when you think of substance abuse, might think of drug addiction or drug abuse, and the current DSM criteria names this same disease, disorder, mental illness as a substance use disorder. All of these are fine, but there's something that I realized as we've talked about many different psychological illnesses across the semester that I haven't pointed out, and it's very important, and it always hits me when I start into substance use disorders, which is my area of expertise, that we need to talk about this. So the thing that I just want to point out is that there's something called patient first language. So if we're talking about a disease or an illness, it's better to use terms that have less stigma to them, and that's an important thing. So substance use disorder is considered a little bit better than substance abuse or drug addiction in terms of talking about the entire kind of mental illness that we're talking about. And then the other thing is that when we're talking about an individual that has been affected by a substance use disorder, the terminology that I just use is the best that you can use, because this is just as if you had somebody who caught a case of the chicken pox or somebody that was affected by rheumatoid arthritis, right? We don't stigmatize any of those other illnesses, and we shouldn't stigmatize mental illnesses in that way either. What that really means is that there are certain terms you should avoid as well, because they carry very negative connotations. So addict, junkie, these sort of things. And I've actually seen a number of other researchers get themselves into trouble using this terminology. And I've also seen clinicians or hospitalists get themselves into trouble under these same exact circumstances. So whether you are just going off to some random career here or there that has nothing to do with psychology, and you just happen to interact with someone as a human being to another human being, you should consider the language that you use. But especially if you are headed into research, into the clinic, or anything into mental health practice, whatever it may be, you should consider those choices of language. There are many types of substance use disorder, and we tend to put them into broad categories based off of the type of drug class, and drug class tends to relate back to the kind of receptor that's being acted on. So alcohol, tobacco, cannabis, stimulants, hallucinogens, and opioids are the 6 major classes of drugs that we talk about. And to just key you into my bias a little bit, I've spent a lot of time working in stimulant use disorders. That's been the majority of my time. And more recently, I've spent some time looking at opioid use disorders. So many of my examples will come from there. And that's just my own personal bias. And I wanted to make you aware of that in case you have questions or other things of that nature. That's my area, specific area. So there are a few kind of critical aspects that we look at as a field of drug addiction. And some of you are probably sitting there going, wait, didn't he just say we can't use the word addiction? No, that's not true at all. Drug addiction is still a field. We still have journals called addiction and things of that nature. But it's better to refer to a field, the field of drug addiction, rather than to individuals. So there's a bit of a subtlety there. Hopefully you're all grasping it, but when we're talking about people or patients, we should use substance use disorder, and we should put an emphasis on the person first. That's the idea of patient first language. We first identify the person and what's affecting them, and not necessarily name them by their disease, right? None of you would like to be named by one feature of your being either. That's the idea. So the critical aspects that we study in the field of drug addiction, and many of these relate specifically back to DSM criteria, are things like how someone comes to initiate drug use, how drugs come to have stronger effects in some cases. In certain with certain drugs, people can become sensitized to some effects of that drug, and that we'll talk about that a little bit. And then one thing that's really important for the transition from kind of just substance use to a substance use disorder is that somebody starts to take larger amounts of drug, what we call the escalation of drug intake. And This goes along typically with a number of other things happening. So this is kind of a resource battle. Then people start having to people enter into what you could think of as a conflict. So you start to use the drug despite having negative consequences, where the chronic use of a drug begins to affect your job performance, or your ability to show up to work maybe at all, social and interpersonal interactions, especially when resources like money and other things can become scarce. Substance dependence is another kind of key aspect of the process of drug addiction that we're going to be talking about. And so dependence is kind of the opposite of sensitization, where you start to have tolerance to the drug and withdrawal. And then a lot of people study specific aspects of drug addiction, like craving and persistence, or relapse. So these are all the features, and specific features of these are what the DSM uses to classify a person as having a substance use disorder. We already talked a little bit about instrumental conditioning, and instrumental conditioning plays a really important role in drug addiction, because we have all kinds of cues in our environment that individuals begin to process, and somehow we start out with a behavior somewhere early in time, right? The first use of a drug, because we're introduced to it in some way, we have some kind of an opportunity, there's some curiosity, and we start out with just one simple behavior. I'm going to take this drug. Or in the case of a rat or a mouse, in traditional operant conditioning, or even in models of drug addiction, animal models, you press this lever one time, and what happens is we end up with reinforcement, right? So because this behavior created kind of a positive outcome, then that causes that future behavior to become more likely, and that's the process of reinforcement. We have an increase in the frequency of a behavior based off of a previous outcome. In the case of drug addiction, I want to point out that there are really two possible drives here. So one of these is what we're talking about now, positive reinforcement. This was good, and therefore I'm going to increase the frequency of my behavior because the drug produced some sort of positive or a euphoric effect. But the opposite is also possible, where we can have negative reinforcement. And so negative reinforcement, the best examples I always can think of this is that you might keep your room clean to keep your parents from getting angry at you. So you increase the frequency of cleaning your room to avoid getting yelled at. And so by constantly avoiding being yelled at, that is a thing that keeps your room clean. Or we, all tend to increase the frequency of brushing our teeth in order to avoid a bad report from the dentist, and even certain aspects of what you do in school. So these are also ways that we increase the frequency of a behavior. And in drug addiction, things like withdrawal for a person that's been affected by a substance use disorder, things like withdrawal can be very powerful motivators, because taking more drug to relieve the feeling of withdrawal then ends up being a key driving force in producing more drug-seeking behaviors. So one of the things that is very important for all drugs of abuse, and just happens to be the thing that makes drugs such strong reinforcers, is a quality that we call salience. So salience is just the idea that something is able to kind of capture attention by being something that's very powerful and noticeable or unexpected. And so drugs of abuse, they take advantage of these systems that we normally have to process food or other things like that. And what they do is they take the volume and they turn them up to 11. So instead of having just a little bit of a burst of dopamine, for example, because you happen to get like a really tasty kind of food, and you came across this while you're foraging or something like that, what ends up happening is that we have this giant release of dopamine, and that causes the drugs to be really kind of attractive. And so that quality of salience is kind of the attractiveness of these, and you can think of this as a physiological process. this idea of salience is also why individuals that have a substance use disorder are very careful in planning out the route of administration that they use. So there are some drugs that are smoked and others that are taken intravenously, and typically the routes that are used are ones that have very rapid access to the brain. And are going to produce kind of the biggest high, and there's trade-offs here. I mean, some people that may not like the idea of needles. There's sort of the conflict of the amount of high trading off with maybe kind of this phobia of needles, and that would lead to kind of the picking and choosing of which route of administration. Overall, though, the idea here is exactly what I've underlined here, that having these very strong outcomes by having this incredible amount of salience, that we also support strong behaviors. So if something is incredibly negative, like the withdrawal from opioids, which is very, very strong, then it's going to support really strong drug-seeking behaviors. Or if something produces a really wonderful positive feeling, that's also going to support kind of a really strong seeking behavior. An easy example of this, I mean, if you're the kind of person that has a sweet tooth, is that you're probably going to become more excited and maybe even more willing to bend over backwards to do something to get like a piece of cake than you would be to get like like a stale old biscuit. And both of those are food, but clearly one of them has more salience. One of the key aspects between all drugs of abuse is the mesolimbic dopamine system. So the mesolimbic dopamine system involves dopamine neurons in the ventral tegmental area, and we know that their projections to one part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens are especially important. And what we see is that whether directly or indirectly, essentially all drugs of abuse eventually cause the bulk release of dopamine, and that in many cases, blocking the release specifically to the nucleus accumbens is enough to cause really drastic changes in how reinforcing they are. All of that with the dopaminergic system kind of relates back to the positive, or the rewarding, or as some of us jokingly call the light side of addiction. But a fairly famous addiction neuroscientist, George Koob, many years back coined the idea of the dark side of addiction. And this is that negative reinforcement side that becomes much more important over time. So as we've already said, the idea of negative reinforcement involves kind of typically removing something negative from the environment that increases the behavior. And so if we look just specifically at the example here, that by smoking another cigarette, you remove that feeling of craving. Like you remove the need for a cigarette by smoking a cigarette, right? And so that's something that happens over and over and over and over again, and then you start to build up this behavioral response that becomes a very natural response. A lot of this relates back to an idea that we've already talked about, which is just this concept of allostasis as well. And so the concept behind the dark side of addiction is that drugs produce this giant allostatic load, because originally we might have a very strong kind of positive and euphoric response, but that's almost always followed by some sort of a negative mood state. As the body tries to kind of counteract this really strong, salient, powerful, response. And so this is, the idea of the hangover or the drug withdrawal. Probably many of you have experienced a hangover, so that's a really natural example. I'm not naive to what goes on in college ab most weekends, or most Thursday nights for that matter. What ends up happening over time is that if your body constantly is engaging in this rebound, then you kind of never break out of it, right? So the positives become a little less positive, their magnitude doesn't reach up as high, and then the negatives start to become more negative. And we see this, as we've already talked about, this kind of grand downward trend. You could think of it in many ways as like a true downward spiral, where now the new positive is barely bringing you back to normal, or maybe not even bringing you back to a normal state. And this goes along, of course, with a lot of physiological changes in the brain, and body as they try and react to constantly having kind of these chemicals in your body. So these imbalances are engaging a lot of systems that we've talked about for stress and depression and all kinds of other things like that. And then, of course, the idea is that the only way to get back to normal is then to take more drug. And this is also one of the reasons why we talk about a lot of times the initiation of drug use being due to something like a self-medication hypothesis, because the idea here of self-medication is that some individuals are already going to have this imbalance in their neurochemistry. So they're already going to have an anxiety disorder or some kind of a mood disorder like depression, and that taking a drug will bring you back up to that kind of close to what would seem like a normal homeostatic point. So all of these things are possible. Now, for an individual engaging in some sort of recreational or casual use, this can eventually create a transition. So if you constantly are pushing a system just through recreational use, and you create that allostatic load and eventually cause those feelings of withdrawal to get stronger and stronger and stronger, then what ends up happening is that we sort of drive the spiral down in the other way by not starting with some sort of imbalance in neurochemistry, but by generating it through the repeated use of the drug. So both of these are vital. So one of the key components of this dark side of addiction is the idea of drug dependence. And for drug dependence, there are really two key components here. One of them is tolerance. And tolerance, very simply, is that you need more of a drug to produce the same effect that it used to. So if you were somebody that was taking some sort of pain medication chronically, and instead of now taking a 5 milligram dose to relieve pain, now it takes 10 to take the edge off in the same way, that's the development of a tolerance. It's just that you need more of the drug. And then the second component of dependence is drug withdrawal. And so this basically is the idea that without having some sort of a drug in the system, now the system starts to experience a number of kind of like physical and psychological symptoms just because the drug is no longer present. And these systems, the list here can get pretty nasty, especially for some of the most addictive classes of drugs. You can have things like fatigue, irritability, hallucinations or paranoia, but things can get all the way down into the realm of seizures and trembling and even death in a lot of cases. Very severe withdrawal from alcohol and opioids especially, sometimes needs to be clinically managed to prevent people from having such severe physical symptoms that they can actually die from them. Now, one of the things that I really like to do in thinking about this dark side of addiction is to dispel the myth that this is some sort of a long-term choice. And one of the best examples that I have comes from this paper out of Ron Hammer's lab around 1997. And what they did was that they let animals self-administer cocaine for one binge, right? So this is 36 hours, but it's one binge. So this could be a single use, or maybe you could think of it as a single weekend of partying or something like that. And what they did is they looked at how hard animals were willing to work for certain doses of cocaine, and so you see the kind of how hard they're willing to work on the y-axis here that I just highlighted, and then the different doses here. And so there's a certain amount of kind of desire for a dose of cocaine before the binge in white here. And what you can see is that in these black squares, that after this 36-hour binge, a much higher dose of cocaine kind of becomes equivalent to originally what was the lower dose. So even sometimes within a single use, especially for really powerful stimulants and opioids and things like that, sometimes even a single use is enough to completely change the brain chemistry. And these things are additive. So of course, the longer that a drug is used over time, the longer it's going to take to reset that brain chemistry. And in animal models and in humans, we can see all of these physical symptoms. And so, you can see that tolerance happens very quickly, but even for the symptoms of withdrawal, sometimes even after very limited amounts of exposure, that if you, with opioids, you can induce withdrawal by using a drug called naloxone, which is kind of the same as the Narcan that paramedics and others will give for an overdose. And so even after very limited exposure, if you give, this naloxone or Narcan, you can start to see all these physical symptoms like irritability in the jumps, and you can get tremors and seizures, diarrhea. So all of these things can happen after very, very short amounts of exposure. One of the things that I told you in the emotion lecture is that I've tried and strived in my career to break the mold a little bit and to bring the idea of emotions into the field of drug addiction, because individuals that are affected by substance use disorders are driven by negative reinforcement, but that kind of does this thing that everyone complains that B.F. Skinner did, and it puts the brain into a black box, and it's just, as if we're some sort of a robot or something. And really, we all know that a lot of what's going on is kind of a conflicted emotional state. And so I was actually the first to take vocalizations that work in the rat, and it turns out that these vocalizations have kind of a really cool feature of them, where rats emit some vocalizations when they are in kind of a negative state. So this could be when there's some sort of an intruder or predator nearby, or if you give them a foot shock, then they kind of have this one cluster of calls. All of these are above our hearing range. That's why we call them ultrasonic. And of course, these are the vocalizations, the calls that the rats make. But there's a second cluster that they make when they're in some sort of a positive emotional state. And it turns out that if you look at across different phases of self-administration, then this allows animals to do a lot like what humans do, to say, I'm feeling good right now or kind of bad right now. So if we look at something like withdrawal, and the withdrawal had been looked at for quite a while using these ultrasonic vocalizations, it turns out that if you look after a binge of cocaine, that even again after one of these single binges, that these negative vocalizations can last out to a week, and maybe even as long as 2 before they kind of return back to normal. So it takes quite a while for you to see a return to normal following kind of a long-term usage of cocaine. So again, this all comes back to this idea that we can very quickly enter into this dark side of addiction where negative reinforcement dominates. And this is, there's the Hollywood version of addiction where it seems like positive kind of rules and everyone's partying and everything seems amazing. But things are a little bit closer to the Requiem for a Dream version of things, where there's a lot of kind of negative aspects, that individuals with substance use disorders face. And the withdrawal is can be very, very strong, and very small doses of a drug can produce very long-lasting changes in mood and other things like that. So the way I think about this as an entire model is that substance use can have kind of positives and negatives. So there can, in anticipating drug, it depends on what's happening. So if somebody's anticipating drug because they're in withdrawal, then you might see negative affect predominate. But for others, there still can be this, desire to seek out those positive or kind of euphoric effects of the drug. And when we first have individuals starting to take drug, then you often do have a very short period of positive. And so in animal models, we call this period a load up. But very quickly, this shifts over to where as somebody engages in like a long-term cocaine binge or, initiates drug use, what ends up happening is that, the goal is to start avoiding low points when the drug starts to kind of fade out of the system. And eventually, this will there's going to be a point where the drug runs out, right? Or that you have to change behaviors. And this is going to start into phases of acute withdrawal. And as we just saw in that other graph, that this negative can last even into protracted withdrawal, which can last days to weeks. So we've captured all of this using ultrasonic vocalizations over time, and just proving that these animal models that we have reflect many of the same things that humans will self-report that they experience also. The most important feature from at least a clinical perspective of this dark side of addiction is that it generates a sort of conflict within any individual that is being affected by drug addiction. And we see this in a lot of the DSM criteria, where there's a conflict with how much drug that an individual might take. There's a conflict at the point of relapse. There's also all kinds of interpersonal conflicts that come along with this as people fight for resources like money to obtain drugs and things of that nature. And this conflict is a big part of what creates the societal problem, because this is what causes all of the crime and violence associated with drugs. This is what causes all of the healthcare, burden that goes along with the use of drugs, and any other expenses. You've already learned kind of the key brain system for managing this, as we've talked about other emotions, and this is really just the prefrontal cortex and its connections. And so if we look at the volume of the gray matter in the prefrontal cortex, what you can see is that, compared to some kind of a healthy individual, an individual that's affected by an alcohol use disorder, or even in some other mental illnesses that we've already kind of looked at, we see a decline in that prefrontal cortex gray matter. And this can be additive. So if you have multiple disorders, or if you're a polydrug user, meaning somebody that uses multiple drugs, you might even have an even greater reduction in that gray matter. We know from animal research that this development of the prefrontal cortex becomes very important in adolescence. And we actually saw this already once before. But if you just look at the connections of the mesolimbic dopamine system alone, what you can see is that areas up in the front of the brain near the prefrontal cortex, and including that nucleus accumbens area that we talked about that's really important for the rewarding effects of drugs, these are kind of a very, very critical area for adolescent development, and they also become key areas for drug addiction. So this is why the National Institute on Drug Abuse, who I worked for a period of time, and others really put a focus, and why we have a lot of ad campaigns focusing on, adolescents, because drug use that continues and creates problems typically starts between 15 and 18 years of age. So many of you are kind of past this point in your lives. I don't know if we have any child prodigy college students in the class. I certainly haven't met any of you if there are, but this period of time becomes critical for both brain development and therefore also for the development of a substance use disorder. The other thing that ties this all together is relapse. So it's very difficult to prevent somebody from starting to use a drug, but the thing is that once they've started and a substance use disorder has developed, then the point is that we want to figure out how to reverse some of the changes in the brain in whatever way that we can, in order to prevent relapse, going back to the drug over and over and over again, because drug abuse is considered a chronically relapsing disorder. And there are other disorders that are also considered to kind of have chronically relapsing components. But if you look, and there are two studies up here on the screen, but they both pretty much show the same trend, which is that the number of individuals for various drugs that can remain abstinent out to a year, which is around here in each case, is only about 25, maybe in some cases as high as 50%, but typically down closer to 25%. And actually, in the cases where the rates of relapse carry out a little bit longer, there is still a high rate of relapse. You can imagine these curves kind of carrying out for something like alcohol. But for those that do well, there are better support groups. We have Alcoholics Anonymous and other groups that provide some sort of a support system, some sort of accountability, and that have managed to do something very important, which is to at least somewhat reduce the stigma associated with that substance use disorder. Narcotics Anonymous is another example, and depending on the opiate, there are some differences across these two graphs between a very powerful opiate like heroin and just opiates in general, and kind of combined. But Narcotics Anonymous has also started to make these sort of strides. One of the things that at least it's my goal to have you walk out of here understanding, but it's not necessarily critical to an understanding of kind of the psychological side of drug addiction, is just how we study these things, right? So how do we understand these neural mechanisms? And we talked a lot about methods at the beginning of the course, but in animal models, we also have so many models of drug addiction that we use. In some cases, we give drugs experimentally, so we just give injections into the peritoneal cavity, or basically the stomach of animals. We also have short access self-administration studies, and these kind of mimic maybe more casual use over shorter windows of time. And then we have two categories that are really important, that long and intermittent access, both of which model kind of the amount of drug use that it would take for a human to become dependent. So especially for things, for drugs like cocaine or heroin or other opiates that are taken over very long periods of time, then these models get the total amount of kind of exposure to that substance. And of course, the lifetime of a mouse or a rat is much accelerated compared to a human, but no matter what, these are things that allow us to kind of look at what just the exposure to the drug, or even in the case of these self-administration studies, what the choice to administer drug and the decisions that come with learning something about maybe cues in the environment that predict that a drug might be available, or all of these other things that are the exact same thing for humans. There might be certain people or contexts, neighborhoods or crowds or anything like that you associate with the use of drugs, and those things all become cues. So when we do these kind of intraperitoneal injections, we end up looking at a lot of things. Part of it is to just understand how the drug is working, kind of what the time course is. People do that in a lot of ways. And in other times, we want to just understand how rewarding the drug is. And so a very common task is the conditioned place preference, where one side of a chamber is paired with an injection of something like cocaine. The other side might be paired with nothing, or an injection of just saline, kind of the salt water solution that mimics the fluid in your body most of the time. And you do these injections over and over again, and then you give the animal the choice, like the big question mark over his head now, where do you want to spend your time? And pretty much the overwhelming answer is they want to spend their time where the drug is, because it has rewarding properties. But then we can combine this with some of the other methods we've already talked about, like electrophysiological recordings in the brain, or we can look and stain for whether something in the brain has changed after these tasks. There's another model, and this is mainly used in cocaine self-administration, that looks at the conflict. This is called the runway model. So there's usually kind of a goal box, and a mouse has a starting box that they end up in. And the idea is that they have to kind of run down this alleyway, and eventually, when they run down the alleyway, they go into the goal box. But all along the way, and you can see them here, are these photo beams. And what we can see is something that the mice do, if we were to kind of make our own diagram of it here, which is that as they hit this goal box, we can see how much conflict they engage in. Because if a drug like cocaine, which kind of has both a light and a dark side that can be very powerful, or opiates have the same thing as well, the mice or rats will sometimes go towards the edge, and then they'll stop, and then they'll turn back, and then they'll go back again, and they're making this decision. And so we can watch what happens in the brain as they kind of face this conflict that we've been talking about, that's so incredibly important for many aspects of drug addiction. Of course, one that I already hinted at is self-administration. And so in self-administration studies, you have basically a line that can carry drug, and it's put into to a vein, and so that the drug can be administered intravenously into the vein, much like there are many drugs that humans will administer into the vein. This is where we get the idea of track marks on arms or legs or even between toes that are associated with certain abused drugs, especially opioids in this day and age. And so the self-administration studies are meant to have, you can barely see it here, but cues like a light or even a sound and things like that. And so the animals are in an operant conditioning task where you can see the rat here. He's got his paw up on this lever that's a little bit tough to see, but he's pressing the lever in order to earn an infusion of the drug. And you start to pair things like the environment and the cues and all of these things with the drug, and then you can come back and look at what their influence is and what brain systems might be involved in processing the cues, how they change, and so on and so forth. In a lot of cases, we also use this to study relapse. So you might have a period of self-administration, and this is followed by any number of things. Sometimes it's followed by abstinence, where the rat or mouse is just taken out of the cage for a month, as if they were to have gone through some sort of a program and kind of sobered themselves up. Or sometimes we have extinction, where the animal continues to press the lever, but they don't earn anything, and we also take away the cues and things like that. And this is meant to reduce by the new learning that happens in extinction, the influence of the cues and other things. And then we bring them back in for a test where they hear that cue again, and we see what happens, what parts of the brain kind of light up, if you will, when after a period of time those cues come back. And this could be the same thing as kind of being re-exposed to some of the same individuals or contexts for a human that are very heavily associated with drug use and might trigger that use again. So a very common example of this is that of course we have a system that punishes drug users quite heavily. Time in prison is fairly severe, especially for repeat offenders. And so when people are in prison for a long period of time, we all know that there are drugs in prison, but many people do sober up while they're in prison, and then they get out and they see that same friend, or they go back and interact with the same people or places, and that becomes a trigger. And sure enough, you end up with a lot of drug-seeking behavior happening again, and this causes a relapse. So this is kind of this entire reinstatement model. The rats or mice, they escalate how much drug they take, they learn the change, and then at some point you end up with the animals kind of having what we call in the animal model a reinstatement test, but really this is mimicking the human test of relapse, with the exception that we are controlling the parameters, and so there's some subtleties I won't go into for why this gets named reinstatement, but in the animals we call this reinstatement. And just to point out, I've kind of been focusing on these cues and things like this, but the reinstatement tests are always free of drug. But in some cases, we look at the influence of certain things on this kind of relapse or reinstatement behavior. And so I have a whole list here, but sometimes just drug priming or even using all other drugs. Sometimes people end up relapsing because they're given a prescribed drug that mimics the feelings and other things of a drug they've abused for a long time. Of course, we can use different kinds of cues like the context, or very specific cues like another animal or a person. And then stress is one that is often looked at. And sometimes people even look at things like withdrawal states. So you can kind of create a feeling that mimics the withdrawal in some way. And this is in many ways just another version of stress. Coming towards a little bit of a close here, so let's talk about the neural correlates. So we already talked about dopamine release, especially targeting the nucleus accumbens, as being very important. And one of the things that we know is that this dopamine release correlates with the feelings of high. So the positive effects are very heavily related to the dopamine system. So the more of these dopamine transporters that are occupied, the higher the ratings of high that an individual feels. And something that's kind of interesting is that you can see the effects of withdrawal if you ask humans, because the the ratings of high actually dissipate before the cocaine in the body does. So it's not a perfect one-to-one correlation, but there is definitely a strong relationship. And part of this is this idea that the body comes in once it's had this very strong allostatic load put on it and tries to counteract it. And we can see that in many cases. Another thing that we've kind of already touched on a little bit, so I won't take too much time on it, is that the prefrontal cortex is very important. So the point that I'm going to add here is that, for individuals that have a kind of a higher prefrontal cortex function, they actually have a lower relapse susceptibility. So they're less likely to consume cocaine. But individuals that have kind of low prefrontal cortex activation, and this is something like many parts of the brain we can kind of train to recover over time, those individuals with the low activity are at the highest levels of relapse. Opioids work in a lot of different places in the brain, and there are actually many different places where they have their effects. And so we think of kind of the positive or reinforcing aspects of happening in the nucleus accumbens, which we've talked about quite a bit, and in the ventral tegmental area. There are also effects that, as many of you know, opioids are used to induce analgesia. And so the analgesic effects are linked mainly to the periaqueductal gray and reticular formation. I should note you don't specifically need to know these brain areas. You should just kind of know that there are multiple effects, if anything. And then, most of these things, at least in terms of the abuse potential, comes back to the ventral tegmental area where dopamine neurons are that we've talked about over and over and over again as being this area that sends these projections to the nucleus accumbens. One of the ways that we know that the mu opioid receptor is very important, and especially its interactions with the dopamine system, is that if we knock out the mu opioid receptor, then what we end up doing is we can both block the effect on pain, so animals no longer will withdraw their paw more slowly when they're given morphine. So a normal mouse, if you give them a high dose of morphine, like this 6 milligram per kilogram, they should have a pain blocking response. But if we knock out the mu opioid receptor, like they do here, then we don't see that anymore. But also when we do this, we eliminate that conditioned place preference. So mice that have the mu opioid receptor kind of taken out of their brain genetically, that's what we mean when we say a knockout. Those mice no longer show a preference for the side of that 3-compartment box I showed you a few slides back that are paired with morphine. Most stimulants, in looking specifically at their effects, are either direct or indirect dopamine agonists, meaning that an agonist is something that binds to a receptor and activates it. So these activate the dopamine system directly. And you can see that over time they produce changes, where in a normal individual you would have kind of a certain level of dopamine binding, and over time we kind of have this contradictory response in the system. So this changes, the level of the dopamine receptors after repeated administration. We also actually see this in Parkinson's disease, where there are lower levels of dopamine over time. And what this also ends up doing is it ends up being a part of what changes these feelings of high. So by having less dopamine receptors, you actually end up also having kind of less effects of the drug. And we've already gone over what this is, but this is what tolerance looks like in the brain. And you could imagine a very similar effect to this one with opioids as well. Nicotine works on a class of receptors that are called nicotinic receptors, and so that should be an easy one to remember. The primary ingredient in cigarettes or in e-cigarettes is nicotine, or at least the primary abused ingredient. There's some debate on this. I'm not going to get into that, but we know actually that there's very interesting. There's this tiny area of the brain called the medial habenula, and pretty much all of the reinforcing effects of nicotine exposure rely on this medial habenula. And there are actually a couple of different theories of how this works in terms of creating kinds of a positive or a rewarding effect in the brain. One is that there are nicotinic receptors on dopamine neurons, so activating these, of course, would activate dopamine and create kind of a little bit of a positive state. And the other thing is that nicotine has some actions on a group of enzymes called MAOIs, or monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So dopamine is a class of neurotransmitter that falls into this category of being a monoamine, right? So these monoamine oxidases are part of a group of chemicals in the brain that would degrade that, and so nicotine acts on the inhibitors in order to kind of create a higher dopaminergic tone in a very indirect way. So that's another theory of what might be going on, and because both happen, it's unclear which is more responsible, and it'll take technology getting a little bit better for us to answer that. So both theories might be true. We also know, and this is a really interesting thing, if you think back to the lecture on emotion and sort of how everything that we're doing is playing back into these systems that are already in place for sensory and motor behavior. The relapse for cigarettes is really highly dependent on a part of the brain called the insular cortex, which you'll remember is important for ingestion and gustation and things like that. And so if you inhibit the insular cortex, then you can reduce relapse in rats or in mice. And the way that we found this out is actually incredibly interesting, which is that some patients that have had strokes in the insular cortex just immediately stop smoking. And so this is in some ways kind of weird, because the area that's associated with all of these maybe like facial and oral effects of cigarette, like almost like the consumatory behavior of cigarettes, if you eliminate that, then you eliminate smoking behavior in some individuals at least. Of course, we can't just go in and lesion this part of the brain. If you haven't learned anything from all of the examples of patient HM in this class, or any lesion at all, you don't really want to go in and start lesioning parts of people's brain. It can create all kinds of unintended effects. But as we get better with genetic targeting and with pharmacotherapies and even cognitive behavioral therapies, it does give us some guidance for how to maybe focus these to become a little bit better. So if we can find something that's specific to an area, we can start targeting that area. Or even things like deep brain stimulation, which might create temporary changes in the circuitry there. So alcohol is a particularly fascinating drug in that it has two effects of action. But what makes it fascinating is that it targets two of the most ubiquitous neurotransmitters in the brain. So it's an antagonist, or something that blocks or shuts down NMDA receptors, which are the glutamate receptors that we talked about that are critically involved in learning and memory. And at the same time, it works as an agonist for GABA receptors. So glutamate is considered typically as an excitatory or an activating neurotransmitter. GABA is the opposite of that, considered an inhibitory neurotransmitter, or one that shuts neurons down. And it turns out that alcohol pits these two against each other in a very, very strong way. And this is why alcohol has such a strong effect on the brain. These receptors are everywhere. So this acts on almost every receptor. And this is probably what brings us, in some cases, when the effect is very strong, to the idea that many have either heard about, or some may know all too well, of becoming blackout drunk, because we have such a big effect on the brain that it's having trouble functioning, and of course can lead to very severe things like death. Much like the opiates and the stimulants, there's kind of an ultimate positive and negative effect. We think that that the positive effects are actually through these GABA receptors, kind of shutting down other GABA neurons and causing the disinhibition of dopamine neurons. So we shut down the neurons that would normally be shutting down dopamine neurons, and we kind of release the brake on them and allow them to release more dopamine all throughout the brain. But also, because these negative effects are or because these effects are so pervasive, that means the negative effects are also going to be incredibly pervasive. So the stronger the allostatic load we put on the brain, the greater the rebound is going to be. And in this case, in the case of alcohol, as is the same for opioids, the rebound effect is so strong. One specific role of those opioid receptors I just hinted at is that they have an important role in craving. So what you see is that if you look at the number of opioid receptors that we have some sort of binding to, and you ask people what their levels of alcohol craving are, is that basically more opioid receptors means more alcohol craving, and less opioid receptors means less alcohol craving. So you can see that there's some sort of a change in upregulation in individuals with an alcohol use disorder as compared to what we might call healthy controls. So this just shows that there are all kinds of plastic changes going on in the brain, and they not only lead to withdrawal and other symptoms that are sort of uncontrollable, but they also lead to some of the things that people like to think are controllable, like your craving. Well, why don't people just stop going and drinking alcohol? Well, there are physiological changes in the brain that cause these urges or drives that we think of as craving to need to have these substances once the plasticity or changes in the brain have taken place. In terms of the effects of cannabis, which is found in marijuana and many other things, as you all know, on the brain, it's really easy to remember because the receptors were named after the fact. We found these receptors kind of much later than many others in the brain, and so the receptors are called cannabinoid receptors, named after cannabis itself. And what we know is that these receptors tend to be kind of at the end or the axon terminals of neurons. They tend to be very important for all kinds of retrograde transport. And we also talked about a little bit of effects on learning and memory, I believe, at one point. But the long-term use of these, of course, because it's affecting neurons, can lead to many things. But schizophrenia has a very high comorbidity that's associated with the long-term use of cannabis. And of course, just to tie everything back, the use of cannabis can lead to an increase in dopamine. So if you just look at when THC hits the system, and then you look at dopamine release in the brain, here at the starting point is 100%, but we can drive an increase in the release of dopamine that lasts for a pretty long period of time, kind of consistent with the effects of the drug on the brain. One of the things that the National Institute on Drug Abuse and many others have been interested in is this secondary component of marijuana, which is cannabidiol. And from all of the scientific evidence that's coming out, cannabidiol might as well be kind of like snake oil. So it does have some anxiolytic properties and can work as an antipsychotic, but it doesn't work for many of the things that people claim that it does. And actually, one of the things that we see is that it doesn't really have the same reinforcing effects. So if you look at just how pleasant something is rated, of course, individuals that were given high THC and high CBD rate food cues fairly highly. But if you look at the cues related back to the different substances themselves, THC is rated really high, just like food is, but the cannabidiol doesn't really create a strong positive rating. And then if you give images that are neutral, of course, these create a lower rating than everything. But there's not much of a difference between these CBD ratings and these control ratings, potentially not even something that rises to the level of like a statistical difference. One of the problems with this statement that I'm making, and I'll put my own bias out front for a minute, is that we just don't have as much information. Although what I will say is that over the past maybe 3 to 5 years, the amount of information that's out there has gone up quite a bit. So maybe the jury is still out, but all signs point to no in terms of there being very beneficial effects of cannabidiol. So starting to wrap things up here, let's look at 3 primary risk factors that are really important for substance use disorder.
The first is genetic susceptibility. So there's about a 40 to 60% heritability rate, and it's really tough to tell. We don't have as many of twin studies and things like that as we would like to be able to gauge the true heritability. And what's likely is that there's a mix of nature and nurture that are contributing to the development of a substance use disorder in most individuals. So despite the fact that you might have a parent that has a substance use problem, that's not a guarantee, but some of the life exposures might then help contribute to that. Speaking of that, environmental factors like early life stress or trauma or any number of other things are another risk factor. And so if you put these two together and you see the potential for that nature and nurture component, then in many cases, this becomes the double-edged sword that can be incredibly tricky to overcome. Again, in a household, if there's a high level of substance abuse over a long period of time, especially as somebody's growing up. And then the last thing is that we know the presence of a few other mental illnesses that would fall into these other two categories of risk as well could be important. So anxiety, of course, creates a lot of early life stress. Anxiety and depression also have a high genetic susceptibility. Chronic pain maybe is independent, but it creates a level of stress. PTSD creates the trauma that we're talking about. And some individuals are genetically susceptible to having those kinds of problems. So all three of these put together, they often interact, and that's what makes it so difficult to tell exactly what the contribution of one versus another might be. But many, many studies have shown that these are the primary risk factors.
There are a lot of different types of therapies. This is a really important one, but some of the key ones are replacement therapies. So if you know anything about methadone, this is an opioid replacement, and it is a little less reinforcing or rewarding. It lasts a little longer, so it becomes kind of a replacement that has less risk, but allows people to wean off. Another replacement therapy are kind of like the nicotine patches and things like that. There's actually a really cool study that bound cocaine to, I think it was a cholera toxin, and so there are a few cases where we've even created vaccines to where the body starts to recognize and have a negative response to drugs. This worked in principle, but often drove people to other drugs because you still have a lot of the underlying neurological changes, so perhaps in the future combining this with other therapies. Cognitive behavioral therapies are very strong, especially for nicotine. Reduction therapies, where you reduce the amount of drug taken over time. This is something that else has worked really well for nicotine and a few other drugs. There are certain antagonists and blockers that can work. Naloxone, there's kind of some long-lasting shots and things like that where individuals have kind of a long protection from opiates binding on the receptors. And another one that's probably the most famous of these is antabuse. So this blocks the enzyme that helps to metabolize alcohol, and so this actually causes alcohol to make someone very, very sick. And of course, the problem is that if you know that taking this medicine makes you feel sick when you drink alcohol, then the compliance for taking the medicine is a problem. And we're starting to explore more about the deep brain stimulation. So we think that this is changing what's happening at a synapse, but we're still finding kind of the right areas of the brain to stimulate in order to have really long-term effects, and the protocols that are needed in order to reverse some of the neurological changes that these substance use disorders have caused. All right, so there's this giant table here. I'm not going to go through it as a part of my lecture, but what I want you to recognize is that this table is very important. This is pretty much the table that lays out what a drug is and what its primary mechanism of action is. So where does it act? In some cases, it's two places, but for most of them, they work primarily at one place in the brain. And I talked about a lot of these over the past few slides. But since you stuck with me for the entire hour that I've been lecturing thus far, there will be a question related to this table on the quiz. There will be a question related to this table on the quiz.